do you assess that?
So I have a slide on classification if we get to the presentation
Okay.
in a moment, but certainly happy to speak to your question. Typically, what we're able to do is we can divide assessment classification on one property. So an example is if you have a hair salon in the basement of a residential property, the property would be predominantly classified as residential. We determine what the occupied floor area that is that specific use and classify it appropriately. The caveat there is with commercial classification, typically what we're looking for is someone who is sort of conducting business at that property. So patrons of the business are sort of coming or going from the property, parking on the property, sort of utilizing that area. So imagine a retail space, a salon, professional office, this type of thing. We would typically have a look at those and determine the extent to which it's a commercial use within the square footage of the total property and apply what we call a split classification there. If folks who work from home, so if you have something like a home office, that type of thing, that's typically not considered to be commercial from a classification perspective.
Even though you had a little sign in front?
If you had a sign, it would be. So the sign is one of the things that we typically will hang our hat on in addition to reviews of municipal change in use permits, this type of thing. Typically what we'll do is when we become aware of a property like that, we'll investigate it. So another one is if you have a sort of an automotive repair business on site in a separate building, we would be able to classify that separately.
What if you didn't have any patrons coming and going, that was only more or less, let's say you had a carpenter, you did small jobs contracting, you had a sign just out front of your residence, no patrons coming or going, would you still classify that the same way?
So I would say that if the business is conducted off-site, because many people in the trades would store equipment in the evening, outside of work hours in their home, that typically would not be a commercial classification.
Okay.
It's when the business starts to transact at that property. So if you have an office where your bookkeeper is working, in the shop where you're keeping the gear, and people are coming to pay invoices, this type of thing, then we'd start to look at that and say that's a commercial classification. If there's a sign out but no one is visiting the property, I'd have to say it's sort of a case-by-case basis, really, in terms of the nature of the business that's occurring at that property.
We would typically inspect, take a look.
Exactly.
The owner, make a determination based on what's there, what's it being used for, how's it being used, that type of thing. It can be kind of gray. Like, it's a little simpler if they've got a website, they've got it advertised, they've got a sign out front, there's people coming and going. That's a duck, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, and so on. Other ones, it's a little grayer. So.
Does that answer your question, Keith?
It does, but I just wondered how much leniency was in there. Somebody's doing, doing their books at the kitchen table and taking orders over the phone, on a part-time basis.
Yeah, so I would say typically.
I don't want to discourage people from starting small home-based businesses, but
Yes.
I don't want them taxed to death neither.
So things like an e-commerce business, typically, until it gets to that level where people are coming and going from the site, that typically wouldn't be considered commercial. However, it's one of these, as we become aware, if we're asked to investigate a property, it's a case-by-case basis when it's when it's a bit of, as Paul mentioned, sort of an odd duck, something a little bit different than typical. We're certainly always happy to investigate if asked and take a look and see if there's a determination made that we need a commercial classification on that property. Because we obviously owe a duty to the municipality as well to correctly classify the property under the Act and make sure that the appropriate tax rate is being levied on that portion.
To me, it's a balancing act for home-based businesses. We encourage that, but we don't want to tax them out of existence.
Absolutely. And another interesting point, Paul mentioned the state date, and in terms of classification, it's kind of an interesting principle because what we do is we look at the use of the property as of December 1st, the state date. So for this year's assessments, it's December 1st of 2022. So if you had a business on the site on December 1st of 2022 or prior, then that gets a commercial classification for this year. The same, and it also works in reverse. So if you open a business on December 2nd, 2022, you would have your commercial classification reflected on the following assessment roll year. So there has to be that stop point. And I always explain that it works both ways. So folks who have closed a business, let's say they've retired and closed the automotive shop, they're using it for storage of their own personal vehicles, this type of thing. Typically that wouldn't be commercial, so we would inspect the property. And if they can provide evidence that the business is closed, taking the sign down, that type of thing, we certainly are more than happy to take that off. But it typically happens for the next assessment roll year. The same as when you start a business, right? It's always hung on that sort of December 1st, the use as of that date, physical state as of that date. Sorry, Paul.
Yep. We'll
Shirley,
move
are you
along.
able to find the market slide there? It's
We have another question here.
slide 10.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
My soccer partner.
I don't know who's gonna answer this one, but if piece of land was sold, and how you determine the assessment on it? Like, I notice some land would be sold for 150,000 and the assessment on it go up to 60,000, and some of them go to the full price.
We look at all sales, Eli. Through the year, we'll collect all the data on those sales, and on a mass appraisal valuation method, we'll look at them all, we'll review them all, determine if they're market value type of sales to be included in our analysis. Then we look at those sales, and some will be higher than others, some will be lower than the others. We work with means and medians and mass appraisal techniques that sort of determine, and then we determine sort of the values based on the review and analysis of those sales. I don't know if that answers your question, and maybe I didn't quite pick it up right,
I
but
think, do you mind if I?
No, go ahead.
And I think I understand what you're asking, and I think if I can offer a little more in that context with regard to how an assessment might change when it transacts. Is that more in line?
Yeah,
with what you
some
mean?
land go to the
Because
up
some
to the full
assessments you'll
sale price.
You'll see a change when that property transacts, and others you may see less of a change.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
So part of that, and that ties into the review process that Paul was talking about. We review all of the transactions that come through the Nova Scotia Registry of Deeds, whether they're deemed to be market sales and apply to our general reassessment of a total area to tell us what the market is doing, or the other thing that we do is we look at that individual property and what's assessed to that property. So there's many reasons why we would review an individual property account annually. So examples would be a building permit or a assessment appeal, or someone calls us and has questions about their assessment. We're always reviewing data to the extent that that data is available to us. We also use imagery to look at data. So we fly several parts of the province annually, and we do review that imagery on sort of an ad hoc basis as well as en masse. But when a property transacts, especially in the context of residential property, it's a little bit different from commercial. We will take a look at the data that we have assessed. So we'll say how many bedrooms and bathrooms are assessed to this property, and what is displayed on the, say, quite often a realtor's listing cut, where we have a significant amount of information, often disclosing recent updates to a property. And some of those updates may have been known to the assessment office, and some of them have not been, potentially. And so we always take the opportunity at that time to correct the data on the assessment account. And that's what determines, in addition to the change in the market year over year. So the property market since last year's assessments has changed significantly throughout the province of Nova Scotia. And that's applied to all assessments. But in addition to that, we also assess physical changes. So if the property we have assessed is more depreciated, let's say, so we were unaware of, say, a kitchen and bathroom renovation that was completed, say, 5 years ago, and we see that information in a realtor's listing cut, it's our duty to sort of correct that data at the time that we review the sale, and that can potentially have some impact on the assessment in the following assessment roll year, in addition to the market changes that would be applied to that property. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about CAP in the future slides, so I think I'll save my CAP explanation.
Yeah,
but
but
I hope
my-
that provides a little bit of
My
extra context.
question was about bare land, so there's no kitchen, nothing involved, just the bare land,
About
the
vacant land.
resource land, yeah, like,
So there's a number of reasons why vacant land can change. Again, it's a review of the data. It would also be a review of sort of the surrounding land use. The additional thing that can change, if we're talking about rural land, is how farm and forest land is assessed and classified is different based on the use, and that's contained within the Assessment Act in the province of Nova Scotia. So some properties are classified as exempt from taxation, which means they're paying, if it's a forest property, 25 cents per acre. If it's a farm property, there's no taxes being generated, is my understanding. So what we do is we review the use of the property, and if the use changes, that could potentially change the assessed value as well.
Thank you.
No problem.
All right.
The question here from the ward. Oh, okay.
Just following up with Eli, if I understood correctly, the question was around a property sold for, say, $100,000 and might have been assessed previously at 50, that the assessment, A, may not change after it sells for double that, or B, it may go up to 75 and not the 100. Is that?
Actually, I bought one and went to the full price, so that's
Yeah.
why I asked.
So I guess I
Yeah.
think I'm understanding he's saying, why do some pieces of land, when they sell, we don't assume that what they sell for is market value? It's based on different than the sale price.
So it has a little bit to do with the base date under assessment as well. So we may have a sale of a property, and we may be able to correct the data on that property for the state date, which, remember, is 11 months closer to the date of the assessment than the base date is. So it may be market evidence for the following year, but the data is relevant for that year. So when we find, a deck that's been constructed that previously wasn't assessed, or some renovations that maybe previously haven't been captured on that property, we take the opportunity to correct the data so that we understand what sold, and that helps us be accurate in our reassessment. Because when we look at assessment to sale ratios, and the data is not reflecting what's on site, it's not telling us exactly what the difference is there. So we want to make sure that we're accurate, because that information is relevant to our general reassessment, telling us what the market is doing in a given area.
And we'll review every sale independently and say, oh, how does this compare to, the homogeneous properties similar to it in the neighborhood as well. So one sale may not be considered, although it may be considered a market value sale. Someone may pay more than what someone else may pay. So we're talking, like I say, we're working means and medians. Some may be outliers, some may be lower, some may be higher, that type of thing. So we're typically setting homogeneous vacant land sales at a similar price across that geographic area in that homogeneous or that market area, so that the properties next to each other would be fairly consistent in what the values are, even though one may sell for 60,000, the other one might sell for 30, and you're sort of working that in using multiple sales across that area.
And I guess that's where we get caught up, because we assume that the market price is what you paid in the market, and it's not always.
Not always.
And mass appraisal is a little different than single property appraisal as well, in that we're taking large number of properties, comparing them in homogeneous market areas, and we have to move all the properties sort of consistently and fairly in those areas, or have them valued consistently and fairly in those areas. And so we use all the sales and not just one sale sort of to determine. And and we get the question quite a bit, is like, this one sold for 150, so why is it appraised or assessed at 125? It's because that's what the market's telling us that it should be assessed for on a mass appraisal type of system. So the sale doesn't necessarily drive exactly what the assessed value is going to be.
Thank you.
All right.
Go ahead, continue.
All right, do you have one before you? All right, so this might be a little bit tricky to see, so I'll walk you through it or whatever. But speaking of markets back in 2021, and even before that in 2020, when the pandemic first started, our data scientists created this data model in 2020, shortly after the start of the COVID pandemic. We were interested to see if sale prices were going to follow an established pattern. So the black line if you can see it at the bottom, there's a black and red line at the bottom. It starts over in 2013, 2014, where you see that date. So that line represents the historic pattern of sales prices in Nova Scotia from 2013 onward. So they went back and looked at historic sales. The black line is historic, the red line is anticipated based on their modeling. So as you can see, it follows a nice pattern, albeit up and down a little bit. It follows a pattern with a slight increase in price starting in 2018 and going up slightly from then until the beginning of 2020. And that's shortly after the pandemic outbreak. Now, back in early 2020, a lot of people thought real estate markets were going to drop because pandemic, worldwide pandemic, that's going to have a major impact. Real estate prices are going to drop. But it didn't. As you can see here, shortly after the pandemic outbreak in 2020, the black dots, the black line, started to climb steeply upward. That was the actuals, what happened. It went way beyond the anticipated range. The anticipated range was still the red line that continued on at that much lower level. So you see the steep upward since the start of the pandemic. And you see those two orange lines that are like goalposts in the middle. Those goalposts represent the time period of 2021, calendar year 2021. So the assessment roll that you have now before you for 2023 is based on that type of value trending in 2021 between the goalposts. So it was steeply upward during that time. Now, we continue to monitor these sales prices on an ongoing basis. You can see that in 2022, it continued to go up sharply, and then it dropped sharply. So what 2022 will bring in our analysis, we're just getting started to review all the sales during the calendar year 2022. That'll be reflected on the 2024 roll. So keep in mind between the goalposts here, and then looking back to 2021 or thinking back to 2021, the headlines in the news, you can see before you that you would have been reading back in 2021 were soaring material costs, home prices remain high. This is the busiest year ever for housing, market prices up 18%. So that's the type of headline during the time period that the sales for the 2023 roll reflect. So the 2023 roll reflect that type of market environment at the time. And I'm going to pass it over to Rod to show you your numbers.
Thank you, Paul.
Hold on, I'll just gotta switch the mics here. I just have one question before you get on with that. So,
Sure.
with those articles you have published there about the busiest year for housing, the last 4 to 5 months, everything has been talking about 21% reduction through Vancouver, 18% reduction in Toronto, 12% reduction trending in Nova Scotia. So, forecasting out, right, from what the trend you're seeing now, not holding you to it, but best guess would be that we are looking for a downturn in overall assessed value for the following year.
I would say it's too early to tell for sure. We haven't started our analysis. I think that certainly there was an uptick at the start of 2022. There's a downtick now. So, and 22 is pretty much over. So I don't know where it's going to go as far as when we finish our analysis, but we don't speculate. We don't forecast. We look at sales 1 year prior to and use market evidence on which to base our trends. So I'll allow you all, have read the newspapers coming. You can predict as you wish, but we wait until we analyze all of our sales, and then we see where the trend is taking us, and that's how we do it. So.
Yeah, because I've had residents who bought houses in 2021, and their assessed value is hundreds of thousands of dollars above what they paid for it in 2021, right? Just based upon where they bought in the year, right? And they're like, well, market value is what I paid for it in 2021 or 2022, but you're telling me the market value is so much higher. And for the average person, that's very hard to understand when they make a large investment like that and they buy it at their market value, and then all of a sudden they're being told their value is so much more. And for the average homeowner, and for every homeowner really, your house is worth nothing until you decide to sell, right? Only at the point of sale is there any value in your home, because until that point, most people aren't fortunate enough to buy a house outright with cash. They're within a budget and a mortgage, right?
It's certainly probably the largest asset for the vast majority of people, that's for sure.
So it's just one of those things. Like, was there any direction from the provincial government or anything, knowing that this COVID, I'll call it a bubble because that's what we all lived in during that period of time, was going to be an anomaly as compared to the 9-year trend previous before that, and to take that into account when doing the assessments moving forward?
No, we work strictly with sales reviews, the actual market evidence. That's what we use.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. So I'm conscious of time here. Thank you, Paul. I'm just going to move on. It's going to be page 12 for those of you who have it printed. I think I have slide 12 here, so you can see a little bit of information displayed on this regarding the East Hants assessment roll specifically. I took a look at some of the provincial numbers, which have recently been reported in the media as well. Pleased to announce it's sort of a good news story for East Hants, I think, with this municipality outperforming the province by most measures. And as you may have heard reported in the media, I think overall assessment lift number 5 in the province. So congratulations on that one. Total assessment roll is $3.26 billion for 2023. The majority of that, as is consistent with the remainder of the province, is predominantly residential assessment. So 2.97 billion total residential. If you count cap impact into that, so these are properties which are capped that have a taxable assessment that is lower than their assessed value. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a future slide, but residential assessment with cap, 2.47 billion. The commercial assessment roll in East Hants is $289 million this year, and there was a little bit of an increase there that actually outperformed the province as well. That's due to a couple of factors. Many of you are aware of some of the commercial construction happening here in the highway corridor, as well as a busy residential construction season. Speaking of that, we reviewed 502 building permits that were relevant to the 2023 assessment roll in East Hants. So we had, I think at the peak, I look after most of the permit logistics for sort of western Nova Scotia, so from the corridor here and the western part of the province, and we have another assistant director who works in northern Nova Scotia. And we had at the peak, we think probably 33 assessors province-wide, and I had probably 4 in East Hants completing work regularly, just due to the permit volume and the volume of new construction in East Hants. So a significant number of living units added, and lots of a significant amount of value added to your residential roll there as well. There was 1,084 qualified property transactions in East Hants. So what this is these are properties transactions that after a review we would consider relevant to our reassessment. So it could be vacant land, vacant commercial land, commercial property, or residential property. And we reassess all of those things differently based on how we're valuing those properties, which is what Paul had talked about a little bit, but that's sort of the total sales file that we use to complete the reassessment. We had 129 assessment appeals in 2022. As many of you can imagine, our data scientists predict that due to a more significant assessment increase this year, we may see some uptick in appeal activity, both in East Hants and the rest of the province as well, and we are seeing that a little bit right now, a little bit of an uptick in appeal activity. Of course, as assessment values climb to a greater degree year over year, we typically expect to see more assessment appeals in those years. Additionally, we have a 7.7% consumer price index that the capped assessments have been adjusted by. So any property that's eligible for a capped assessment has been increased by the consumer price index, which is 7.7% year over year. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on the cap slide, but that number is provided to us
by the province of Nova Scotia as calculated by Statistics Canada. So it's not something that's calculated internally at PVSC. It's provided pursuant to Section 45 of the Assessment Act. So I'm just going to move to the next slide here. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I think it's highly relevant in East Hants with what's happening in the corridor here with commercial property. A lot of this has been reported in the media releases a couple of weeks ago as well. But we saw sort of an interesting commercial market in the context where commercial province-wide was up about 7% overall, but we saw significantly larger gains in some sectors and significantly smaller in other sectors. So we saw a very strong apartment market. Everybody's familiar with a lot of talk in the media right now about housing and housing shortages. And because of that demand driving rents up, it's driving up the value and driving up the demand for multifamily property as well. So we saw significant increases to multifamily throughout the province of Nova Scotia, and to be consistent here in this municipality as well. Industrial property, we saw a very strong demand. So the well-known business parks in the province. I know you have a small business park here in East Hants as well, but the sort of Burnsides, Bayers Lake areas that see a lot of industrial property, they saw strong demand for that as well. We still see a relatively, a market sort of in recovery in accommodation properties. So you can see in the third photo there, it looks like a photo of maybe the Cambridge Suites, where because these properties were significantly affected by COVID and because we value hotel, motel, tourism properties based on their vacancy rates. So if they're not filling rooms, that potentially can have an effect on their assessment. And because we understand that many of these properties suffered significantly higher vacancy than they had in previous years due to COVID, we have to accurately reflect that on the assessment roll, of course. So I'm just going to move to the next slide here. So this next slide is just a very brief understanding. Certainly, the capped assessment program is something that we get a lot of questions on at PVSC. It's Section 45 of the Assessment Act, and it's provincial legislation that we apply to the assessments based on the provisions of Section 45. So we often explain to folks that we determine the eligibility of the CAP program based on a set of criteria and calculate it based on that criteria, adding the Consumer Price Index each year. But basically, this is how it looks on a typical assessment notice. So you have here a property that's a residential property. We have the assessed value. It's the first circle, $416,800. This is what we're saying the property is worth as of the base date for the assessment. So in the context of 2023, we're taking what physically existed on the property as of December 1st of 2022, basing it on the market as of January 1st, 2022, so 1 year prior. And what that does is allows us to capture predominantly new construction. So an example in the corridor area here in East Hants where you have a significant amount of new construction happening. Of course, we want to see all of that reflected on the assessment roll for the following roll year, but we're basing it on market data from 1 year ago. What that allows us to do is review all of those sales and make sure that they actually are telling us something about the market so that they're not getting back to the question from earlier about a sort of market bubble. We want to be able to, as much as we can, normalize market activity and say this is consistent. And so if there is that one oddball overpayment in a given area, we're not going to necessarily move all of the assessments with that. We're going to sort of normalize it over all of the market activity that we see over 1 year and say this is where it needs to go based on what the market is telling us. So the third column is the capped assessed value in this case. So this would be calculated based on a previous year's assessment brought forward by the Consumer Price Index. The taxable assessed value is always the lower of the two numbers. So I always explain to folks that the capped assessment program can never harm a property owner from a perspective of taxable assessment. There can be a scenario where in a flat market, if assessed values move less than the Consumer Price Index and you've purchased a property recently, it's possible that you could be eligible for a capped program, eligible to meet the criteria under Section 45, but the cap doesn't print on your notice because it's actually higher than your assessed value. In that scenario, the following year's cap calculation takes the lower number and adds the CPI. So it's always resetting to the lower number. And in this case, they have some cap advantage, 372 versus 416. The lower of the two numbers, that 372 is the taxable assessment. So I'm just going to move to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about the inquiry and appeal period. It's of some relevance as we are currently within it. We're about halfway through right now. So we mailed assessment notices January 9th of this year, and pursuant to Section 63 of the Assessment Act,
all property owners in Nova Scotia have 31 days to appeal their assessment. All of that information is contained on each assessment notice and on our website as well. So the appeal period for this year is January 9th to February 9th, 2023. And we currently have, again, talking about increased assessments, we expected an increased call volume this year as a result of the increases to assessed value and the increase to the CPI. We often expect to see a significant increase in call volume. I'm happy to report that our call volume has been, while it's been up a little bit, we certainly were anticipatory of it. And we have over 60 staff available on the phone daily to handle calls from property owners and talk about assessed value, why assessments have changed year over year, and determine whether we just need to explain an assessment, as it is in many cases, and also just advise on the appeal period and explain that that process does exist for property owners should they choose to take that course of action. So appeals, sure.
Oh, just curious, should you have a significant number of appeals from one area, and should they be successful, then that would affect the roll the next year? Would that be
I would say it
right?
would depend on the nature of appeals. So it's possible that there could be a significant volume of appeals in an area and with different grounds to them. I would say if all of the appeals had similar grounds, so if everyone appealed, let's say we had vacant lots in an area and they were all valued at $150,000, and everyone appealed and was successful in reducing those lots to $120,000, we would certainly make a strong consideration to carry that through to subsequent assessment rolls, as it's been sort of well established that evidently that's the value of those properties. It's not something that we see frequently in terms of multiple appeals in an area, so I think it would really depend on the grounds, but certainly it's something we would consider, and we keep an eye on those trends as we're taking appeals. So if we see a trend for a certain issue in a certain area, then that's certainly something that we have our focus to. Typically with appeals, it really depends on the context. So you're always appealing one assessment roll year, and it's up to the director or a representative of the director, typically the assessor, to make the determination should that reduction, if you are successful, carry through to subsequent assessment roll years. And in the lion's share of situations, it typically does, but we do have the ability to make that determination. Should it change again? Should it go back up? Or should it remain the same, basically? And then, of course, all property owners have the ability to appeal annually.
Now, if there's, I was gonna say, if there's an appeal, would an assessor visit the property, or would it be done by other means?
An
or
assessor
some
would
of
always
both?
make contact with the property owner to understand the grounds of appeal. We have, basically, you're just, on the form, you can sort of check what your grounds are, but we always want to talk to a property owner and confirm the data, because oftentimes, as we're going through the data, we find, we always want to confirm what's physically assessed to the property, understand the grounds, and make sort of a determination based on all of that information, whether we have, I guess, a valid appeal once we look at the market for that property and determine what the sales are telling us, because the test on appeal is market value. So we need to look at sales and say, what's the most likely sale price for this property as of a given date. So that's sort of the process. If it relates to a physical deficiency that we're not able to establish clearly over the phone, so if a property's been demolished or damaged by fire, this type of thing, very often we've already gone through a process to look at that, because we quite often will hear from a municipality about it. If that's not the case, so an example would be a fire that occurred very late in December or something like that, we would determine based on the date, do filed roll changes need to happen? And if there's physical data that we're not able to obtain remotely, or there's a request by a property owner to make a physical inspection, certainly we're happy to do that.
Yeah, I was just curious, I found a calling card from an assessor on my front door a couple of months ago. No idea when or why the assessor was there, but anyway.
Did you?
I think your question was an interesting one too, Your Worship, in that this year was a unique year as far as Hurricane Fiona. And I know the CAO is intimately aware that we were in Cape Breton at the time that it was barreling down on Cape Breton at the Amons conference. So that's a situation whereby there may be multiple appeals in those areas that were greatest affected. And will it, lead to a reduction overall in assessed values? Probably not overall, because it's something that will probably be repaired within a year in many of the properties. But on a one-on-one basis, if many properties, we would look at those on an individual basis to see if damage was done. And we have spent a lot of time doing additional flyovers and sending assessors out to those areas to make sure that we're aware of what did occur there. And so typically for 1 year, we may get quite a few appeals from those areas, but it would probably go back to market the next year if the repairs are done, building permits are taken out, that type of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if someone bought a house in 2020, early 2020, when the cap will apply on that property?
If they bought it in 2020, they're not eligible until 1 year later. So 2020, if they bought it in 2021, it would not be eligible for the 2021 roll if they bought it in 2020. It would be, if it meets all the criteria, it could be eligible in 2022. So if someone bought it, it's one roll year afterwards.
Okay, so if someone bought property and paid like high price for it, and it's capped for that price after 2 years, and now the cap has gone 7.7% on the cap property. So what happened with the real assessment? Like did you see some property drop down, like the real assessment, or they all went up beyond the cap too?
Almost everything went up in excess of cap this year. So it's impossible to speak to every individual property. So properties that have had physical changes that would reduce the value may go below the capped value. So if you remove something from a property, let's say you have a detached garage and you take out a demolition permit, tear the garage down, we visit the property, we reduce the value, we take the value that we had, the contributory value of that garage off of the account. The cap doesn't go down, but it may be that your assessed value, reflective of the market, is lower than your cap. So then that number becomes your taxable assessment, and in future years, the CPI is added to that number. And then capped assessments can also change based on new construction. So if you add a garage to a property, and there was a building permit associated with that, our assessors would visit the property, determine the data, so how big is the garage, what quality is it, this type of thing, and add the contributory value of that garage to your assessed value, and then your cap would also be adjusted for the cost of construction, basically, which can be different than the assessed value, often less, not always, depending on the market area in which you live. So caps are adjusted differently, but they're always adjusted for new construction. So if you tear down an old house, build a new house, you don't necessarily have the same cap when you arrive to that new house. You would still be capped, and there would still be some cap advantage there, typically, but it would be a different cap, reflective of what's there on site. And that's the same reason why my understanding of the intent of Section 45 with being ineligible in the year following purchase, sort of getting back to the original question there, it sort of allows us to look at the data and make sure what's in the cap program is what's sitting on that property, that the house that's capped is reflective of what's there, including renovations, any changes that have happened to the property since the last time it transacted.
And I'll give you a bit of statistics on the cap too here. So before COVID, in 2020, using the 2020 year, 75% of the improved residential properties in East Hants were eligible for the cap and on the cap. As CPI went up 5.4% for the 2022 roll, market values in East Hants went up 11%, I believe it was. 10 capped. The capped assessment went up 10.1. The market went up 11. So that exceeded the cap. The market increasing exceeded the 5.4 cap, and you went up to 83% of properties were on the cap. This year, with a 7.7 CPI and a 20+% market value lift in the assessment, the number of improved properties that are eligible for the cap in East Hants now is 89%. So the vast majority of properties in East Hants, and it's been going up over that period, and that's the interaction between cap and market values. If market values are going up higher, probably going to see a higher percentage of properties go on to the cap because CPI has typically been lower than the market values. Wasn't always the case back 5 years previous to COVID, they were pretty close together.
Yeah, so if you had recently purchased a property, you may see a cap in 2 years displayed on your notice and then a cap not on the notice in other years, because it's sort of flip-flopping between which is lower. In years where the CPI exceeds the market lift, you may go back to market if it's the lower of the two, but it depends on how long you've been capped for. So if you've been capped for 15, 16, 17 years because you've occupied the property for a long time, you may have a cap advantage that is so significant that you're still increasing at that CPI. I just have a couple of more slides here, so I'm conscious of time. With the slide on inquiry and appeal period, this is number 15 here. I think I left it off. Appeals can be emailed, mailed, or faxed. The majority of appeals that we receive annually come in by email now. The instructions are on the back of the assessment notice with the appeal form. There is also a generic appeal form on the PVSC website for those who are not in possession of assessment notice. So we sometimes run into a situation where an address change has not been logged, so someone has not let us know or let the municipality know that their address has changed. They haven't physically received an assessment notice. That doesn't preclude you from appealing in the 31-day period. You can always check your assessment on our website, and you can always appeal, whether you have we can tell who the legal owner of that property is by a review of the Registry of Deeds, and as long as you're the owner, you're able to appeal the property. There is actually a process for a non-owner appeal as well, but I think I'll save that. Appeal form has to be signed to be accepted, so we just need a signed form, whether it's the generic form or whether it's a copy of the notice. And I think just to sort of finalize this slide, we really encourage folks to reach out and give us a call and discuss what the grounds of appeal are, especially in years where we have a significant consumer price index. We often get a lot of folks who will call and say, I really want to appeal because I disagree that my property's assessment should increase by 7.7%. But it's not something that we can address on appeal. That CPI is prescribed to us by the Nova Scotia government. We can't go and say, we really think it should be 5%. It's not possible. It's not within our legislative ability to do. We can determine if the cap eligibility has been calculated correctly. So if you call us and say, I lived in Nova Scotia last year and I can prove it, but you have me as a non-resident and therefore you're not calculating cap on my behalf, that's something that we potentially can look at on an appeal, but that's what we can flush out in a conversation with an assessor prior to sending us in an appeal, and it saves everyone time, makes it a little bit more efficient. So just one last slide on the appeal process. Should a property owner disagree with their assessment, they are able to file an appeal. It's Section 62 of the Assessment Act. There's 3 levels of appeal. The PVSC initial assessor review is the first level of appeal. So we intake those appeals. Last year we had about 7,500 of them. I'm deeply involved with the processing of all of those appeals and will be again this year, I imagine. We have teams of assessors across the province who will each receive a set of a stack of appeals for their area, and they begin to call property owners and they say, just reaching out, we'd like to have a discussion about your property. If the property requires an inspection, we're happy to do that as soon as we're able to get out on the road and start looking at properties, typically in the springtime. And we're always happy to go through the property data, talk about the market, and talk about the changes that have happened to that property and why that is, whether it's been a building permit, a previous year's appeal, or just the market in many cases, or a change to the CPI and the cap. When that review is complete, each property owner receives notification by mail. It's either what's called a confirmation notice, which indicates that we are not recommending a change to the assessed value, or it's an amended notice of assessment, which typically, in the vast lion's share of cases, indicates a lower assessed value. If the property owner continues to disagree with that amended assessment value or with the decision that it shouldn't change, you have 14 days to continue that appeal to the Nova Scotia Assessment Appeal Tribunal, which is a third-party organization where a court chair, there's a hearing arranged, typically they're virtual at this point, between a third-party court chair, a representative from the Director of Assessment, typically an assessor, and the property owner or agent representative for the property owner. Each side is heard, a written decision is issued that is binding. So if the court chair tells us we need to lower the assessment, then we're bound to that for that assessment roll year. If we continue to disagree at that point, it's also possible to escalate an appeal to the Nova Scotia Utility and Review Board, which is a more formalized process at that point. So our contact information is the last part of the presentation here.
this is all available on our website at pvsc.ca as well. Again, I encourage anyone who has property questions to give us a call. We're certainly happy to have an assessor answer any of those questions if required. And we do have a mailing address as well. If people prefer to send a paper copy of the appeal, we also take them that way. So we've had a couple of great questions already, but I'll turn it over to the councillors. Again, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. And I'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and I don't envy the job you guys have to do. First up, Councillor Ting.
Through the chair, just one question. Of the 129 appeals, how many would have been successful that went down, and how many went up, and how many stayed the same?
So I don't have the exact number for East Hants, but I can tell you province-wide last year, we adjusted about just a high 30s, about 37% of appeals were amended, so adjusted, and I can't remember the exact split, but the remainder, it was almost exactly split between what we would call a confirmation, where we've issued a notice of confirmation, and we had about 27-28% withdrawn overall. So what that means is we have a conversation with the property owner, and we all agree. So we say, and the property owner, and that's always possible as well. You can submit an appeal. This is why we, of course, prefer that people call, so that we save that administrative procedure. But if you send in an appeal, because you're up against the deadline or a similar situation, and we talk and we understand why the property changed and we come to an agreement, it's possible to just say, I'm happy with this, I'll withdraw the appeal. We typically send out a confirmation email to property owners that's a receipt of that. And we do the paperwork internally to withdraw the appeal. And of course, you still have the opportunity to appeal the following year as well. So everything corresponds to the existing roll year only. Does that answer your question?
Pretty well.
I'd be happy to follow up with East Hants as well. I don't have the numbers at my fingertips right now, but I would estimate it's relatively consistent with the province.
Well, 129 seems like a small number of appeals to me. I don't know if that is to you, but.
Yeah, well, and if we think we had about 7,500 last year, we have about 648,000 property accounts.
Right.
So it's around 1% or less, basically. Okay. So it's a good news story, generally speaking, I would say.
That answers my question. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. Seeing no other questions, I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for coming today and providing this presentation.
I want to thank you for having us here. You were very generous with your time, and I appreciate it, councilors. Really appreciate you having us here.
Thanks
Thank you
very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, council. Next up is Community Partnership Fund grants. And it looks like we're going to have Atlanta and Joe. Who's starting off? Okay, there we go.
I don't think the report's going out. There we go. All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm here today with the Community Partnership Fund. It's the annual review of the organizations that are in Council's Community Partnership Fund. There are 8 groups who have been receiving the funds this year, and all 8 will continue in the program according to their applications. So the financial impact we'll go over at the bottom, but it's quite comparable to the previous year. So let's just make sure I'm coming along here. Thank you. Each year we review the 8 groups basically in order to have their 2022-23 funding released. They submit their annual report. Because of that, a lot of the documentation is quite dated. So I'll receive a report as early as April, and it would be for year-end December 31st or so on. So some of these things are based on their 2021 reporting. So the first organization is CCOA. We're all really familiar with what they are doing, and they've been receiving funding for just a couple years through this program in the amount of $15,000. Community Rider received an increase this past year. They were very appreciative and are doing really good things with that increased funding. Their ride statistics are getting close to pre-pandemic levels, and their involvement is growing. And the East Hants Family Resource Center, you'll remember they were here in November. They have had a growing mandate, growing services, and increased need, and they did request an increase in funding. And Staff Grant Review Committee met and is recommending a $20,000 grant for 23-24. I would like to note under the proposed not-for-profit insurance grant, which Council viewed last week at committee, East Hants Family Resource Center has been receiving insurance through the community grant under rec operating, and they wouldn't receive that same $1,500 that way. They could still access community grant, maybe in a different way. This is where we get into the community partnership versus community grant, the double titles, but they wouldn't be eligible for the not-for-profit insurance grant, but they would be able to get their community grant for recreational programming and some other things that they do, and we would, of course, work with them to maximize that funding stream. The Historical Society, they have received typically in the amount of around $15,000. This year's budget number is just over $16,000, and it's based on the rent specific for their Park Road facility, as they have been doing since 2016. And the Sports Heritage Society is ticking along. They had some really great movement this year after COVID had slowed them down, and they are appreciative of their funding for sure. East Hants Youth Links, again, they're a group that is fairly active. They received $6,000 from us and have now for 7 years. They are another group that has been receiving community grant for recreation operating expenses, including insurance, and they would not be eligible for the new not-for-profit grant for insurance, but they would be able to access up to $1,500 through the community grant program, but just use it for a different purpose, which is one of the main strengths of the not-for-profit insurance grant, is we're going to get more people using the community grant for recreation programming. Kids Action, they are based out of Annapolis Valley Kings and Hants, of course, and we typically say the Hants north side of their operations. They have been doing some really great things coming through this side of the pandemic in great ways. They're very appreciative of the funding they receive. I was at their AGM actually in the fall, and they were quite surprised how forthcoming East Hants was with the funding and how we make it easy for them to access the funds. And they did say that they had reached out to other groups, the municipality in the valley, and not had the same luck. So they were really appreciative of what we are doing to support their programs. And finally, we have the Senior Safety Program Association of Hants County. It's known by most as Hants Senior Safety. And we have noticed that they've had some struggles during COVID and now post-COVID, but they seem to have leveled out in such a way that they don't have an East Hants coordinator as they used to. So Staff Grant Review Committee is actually recommending reduction of their funding this year. They have been receiving $20,000 after their first couple years, which was a pilot. So for the last 6 to 8 years, they've been receiving funding through the Community Partnership Fund. We definitely recommend that they remain in the program. They are doing good work. It's just since they don't have an East Hants coordinator, the West Hants coordinator is covering both. And as you can see, Very specifically, the 2021 statistics show that they had 75 referrals and new clients and 29 home visits, but the East Hants portion was 28 and 8. So about a third of their services are hitting East Hants at this time. I reached out to the organization recently and asked them about their funding, their activities for last year, and they said that their 2022 numbers weren't official, but she was working on it, and they would be very comparable. They did have some great success in some programming, working with the RCMP on a police academy program for seniors and things like that, and they do have some great programming planned for 2023. What we have noticed as well is their capacity for full operations has been reduced a bit. So they used to run an operating budget of $80,000 to $90,000, and now we're seeing their budget is about $60,000. So they're functioning on a little less. They're not going out and getting the big grants that we have seen them get before. So, and the final note on this is West Hants used to provide a comparable amount, $20,000 as well, and due to some changes in policies there, they're providing $7,500 to this organization. So that helped with our decision on the $10,000. So going forward, this community grant always lines up with our strong community and our strategic plan. We want to provide these groups funding because they're providing services that we as a municipality just couldn't do, and they're very valuable to the residents of our municipality. So the final budget line, as prepared now in 2023, is $132,158, and this is about $345 more than last year, and that's the increase in rent for the Historical Society's funding. And it basically shows a shift of senior safety being reduced and Family Resource Center being raised. So that's the final piece there. The alternatives to this program, council can consider other values to the recipients, of course, as always. And you probably saw there were several attachments to that report, and we compile the standard reports from each organization and make it there for council's viewing. And if you have questions about that or any of these organizations, I am in touch with them on a regular basis. I do try and work with these organizations a little more, in a slightly different way than some of our other groups. I see a grant that would suit them. I reach out to them specifically first before I put it out through the other channels. Sometimes we have a training that we can offer to a few other people. I'll go to the community partnership organizations first and that sort of thing. And that brings me up to the recommended motion, and if you have any questions.
Thank you, Joe. Yep, there's a few people up to speak. First up, Councillor Rhino.
Well, thank you. East Hants Youth Links, just trying to read over there a bit, but I'm not getting a feel for how many youth would be in that or affected by that, or, their program. It's
Keith, could you
It
talk
seem-
into your mic? I can't hear a word you're saying. All I hear is blah, 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 blah.
East Hants Youth Links. Is there a number around of the people that it deals with, has members with, or whatever? I'm just seeing a generic description here, and I just wanted some more background on that.
Sure. So through the chair, this organization runs their after-school program through the middle school, and they have generally weekly events. They, depending on the interest of the event that they're holding, they would have different number of youth coming. So we're typically talking grade 6, 7, and 8. They average like 15 to 20 participants to the after-school component. They will also fund larger events, special events occasionally. They do swims at the aquatic center, an open skate here or there, and some specialized programs in the winter. So it's certainly not as large as it could be when you think about the youth involved. They do, last year, started working with the Schools Plus organization and trying to do a little bit more spread into the high school as well. But for now, it's the middle school.
How are they led? Are they led by adult kind of sponsorship and, or oversight?
Through the chair, the organization has a paid staff, a part-time employee, and she runs the programs and helps design based on the youth's interest, what they're doing week to week, and she plans ahead that way. And then they have an oversight of the board that would employ the coordinator.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, I'm just looking at the Family Resource Center. Can you, I know you touched on this, but can you just reiterate the part about their insurance?
Certainly. So the insurance that they receive funding, like a lot of our organizations, through the Community Grant Program, which is separate from the Community Partnership Fund. So the community grant through the rec operating stream, you can apply for operating expenses for your rec organization. And because there's a level of programming that they offer, they have used their insurance through the community grant, and they receive up to $1,500 annually for that. The reason I mention it is the insurance grant that was presented last week. It does say that Community Partnership Fund recipients would not be eligible for that grant, specifically because if we're looking at 8 organizations here, it would be they're receiving a lot of money towards operating with not very much stipulation on what these funds are for. So we had that as a ineligibility factor. The reason I call attention to it is because they will have to change how they use that funding model. But it's further justification to their slight increase because, well, they're not slight increase, the increase that we're proposing because they do have such high expenses at this time.
Okay, that was my first question, and thank you for clarifying. The other question that I have is on the seniors, the senior safety program. And I realize that there's been some changes and some decreases there, as well as some proposed decreased funding from us and possibly from West Hants as well. Does that seem like it's going to be that program is on a downward slide, or by reducing our contributions that is going to maybe contribute to that? Or I guess we're just going to have to. I realize it's a recommendation. I just, don't want to see the program end up, terminating for one reason or another, and one reason maybe being lack of funding. But yeah, that's just my comment on it. Thank you.
Through the chair, we don't know exactly how precarious they are. I do think if they receive a little less funding from us, they may seek my assistance for some of the other grant programs that they have used in the past. They may start to look for, if we had more going on in East Hants, maybe we could get more funding. So we might try and shift that balance a bit. I do work with all the community partnership groups in maximizing other programs as well, and I would certainly continue to work with them. I would hate to see any group fall apart for sure, and I'm not sure. Can't speak to anything beyond that at this time.
Seeing no one left. Oh, Councillor Mitchell.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the senior safety program, since East Hants doesn't have a coordinator, is that going to affect things going forward with that program?
So through the chair, the organization's last East Hants coordinator left the role at the end of 2019. And there were 2 part-time coordinators, one East Hants, one West Hants. So the West Hants coordinator has picked up the programming at this time. So a lot of times when they offer programming, they're offering it to all residents of Hants County. It's coming through, they're doing programming that's offered sometimes online, sometimes drop programs. They have a lot of other small things that happen, and those things can be done at the same time across both municipalities. And then we see sometimes they'll offer something specifically on one side or the other. The programming would continue. I just think that we've seen a lot less of the home visits and the referrals since the East Hants coordinator hasn't been specifically in that role. And they are continuing to operate. Certainly 2020, 2021, and 2022 have been the same.
So the workload's is adaptable to the one person, or could there be burnout is my,
I'm not sure that I can answer the staffing question about that. I'm
they're
sorry.
just my thoughts, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mitchell. Next up, Councillor Hebb.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will move the recommended motion as presented.
Moved and seconded. Seeing no one left to speak. Question to call, we'll go to the vote. All the votes are in, it's passed unanimously. Are you doing the next one as well? Okay, there you go.
Right back into gear. All right, so thank you, Mr. Chair. The second report is the General Government Grant Program. This is our smaller grant, again, with annual returning submissions, and I'll just quickly go through the organizations involved in this one. We'll see the funding recommendation for the 23-24 draft budget is quite comparable to last year. We're recommending the addition of one group, and I'll explain that further down. And Remembering Canadian Heroes is a group that uses our funds to specifically speak to grade 8 and grade 11 classrooms just in East Hants. They also do this in other parts of the municipality. They budget based on what it costs to go and do these presentations. And during COVID, they didn't get their presentations done. They have a little money remaining from their 2019-2020 grant, and they have not requested funding since. In speaking with the coordinator, he does believe he's back in the schools this year and he's doing some presentations, and for 2023-24 they will likely be looking for funding. So this year they didn't use their $1,000, but we do recommend that the budgeted amount remains in for 2023-24. The second organization is the Hants County Exhibition, and for the last 3 years we've been providing a general government grant for $500 annually towards their large event in September. And we're recommending that amount goes forward at the same time. East Hants Crime Prevention, they're relatively new. They've only been receiving a general government grant since 2019, and it was specifically to cover the insurance that they needed for their Citizens on Patrol program. The amount is $825. They haven't requested their 2022-2023 funding, but it's normally issued in December, January. So I am hoping to follow up with the group. And we don't recommend including this group for $825 going forward in 2023-24, as long as the not-for-profit insurance grant goes through and is approved in time for April 1st, because they would qualify for funding through that new grant program. So we would essentially be moving that money out of here, and they would be getting the money through a different grant program. Hants County Christmas Angels is not limited to East Hants. They run a program supplying gift cards and things to families across the municipality. We have done another follow-up this year about how many families in East Hants are receiving funding through this group. It's quite generous. They definitely hit between 20 and 25 families to the tune of $400 in gift cards, clothing, gifts, and food each year. And they have been receiving money through this grant program since 2016. Their program is quite similar to some of the Christmas programs and that we have in the food bank program, where we issue those general government grants based on donation instead of a true grant. And I'm recommending that this Hants County Christmas Angels be slid into the same budget line as food bank and Christmas program funding, which I'll outline below. And then they would get their money in the Christmas season the same as the other groups. So the East Hants Food Banks and Christmas programs, this just started in 2020. Caring and Sharing, Hants North, Indian Brook, Shumalak, Uniac Wish Givers, and then the year after, Kids Action Program was added specifically for their Angel Tree program. So those are the 6 organizations that I was speaking about before. These groups do not submit their letter the same way that the other applicants in the stream do. They just receive their donation, and they're quite grateful. We get a lot of appreciation for this type of funding. And the newest organization for general government is the Coat Association. They came in September with a letter asking council for support, and through Council Motion C-22299 back in the fall, a grant of $2,000 was issued through contingency for this year, and it was recommended at the time they be considered for annual funding. So they are included in the budget as a $2,000 grant. The contingency would remain at $2,000 in the recommended budget. The contingency funding last year was used for the Coat Association and the small grant given to the 4-H program for their donation. The strategic alignment is much the same as the community partnership with our strong community. To support the organizations as outlined above, it's $13,500. That includes $2,000 contingency for $15,500, which would be $1,175 over last year. So we're adding the Coat Association and taking out the East Hants Crime Prevention because they would be eligible through a different program. And as always, the funding amounts could be identified in other ways by council as an alternative. And I will bring it back up to the recommended motion. And I did leave in the motion East Hants Crime Prevention pending insurance grant. So if that grant was not approved, then we could look at putting East Hants Crime Prevention back in to this funding program. But for now, this is the recommendation.
Thank you so much. First up to speak, Councillor Tingley.
Through the chair, I'll move the motion as recommended, as written.
Second. Moved and seconded. Question or discussion? Seeing none, questions will call. Go to the vote. Motion has passed unanimously.
There we go. Next up on the agenda is a continuation of tax analysis and budget plans. Over to the CAO.
Yeah, they were little when they first started these. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is the continuation of the agenda. Sue is going to do a quick overview of some tax adjustments that we're recommending to date, and the 3-cent commercial decrease, and then I'll continue on with the business plans, and we'll get into capital budgets as time permits.
Thank you, CEO, through the chair. Very happy to be back again to discuss the budgets. Yeah, at our last meeting, there was a request to bring back a proposed decrease of 3 cents on the commercial tax rate. So what we've done is brought this forward just to have council have a look and decide if that's something that they're interested in doing. When we were preparing the amendment that's being proposed, we did, as you can appreciate, we're still going through many of the budgets as quickly as we can to make sure we've captured everything appropriately. We did see where there was a project that Kim actually, CAO, spoke about last week when she was doing the business plans. There's a $55,000 facility condition assessment that is included in the budget for the Lloyd Matheson. And because that is for this building, it can be included for the recoverable costs for the tenants. So when we were going back to look at the 3 cents, we saw that this particular cost can be split between the municipality and the tenants, roughly 40% tenants and 60% for the municipality, because that's the split for how much square footage is commercial here in this building. So we recalculated that, and the portion of the building expense that the municipality would incur, we're proposing that that come from reserves, because that would have been something that we would have proposed if we had this captured last week. And then the remaining 40% would be part of what we would bill out if we go forward with that particular program to the tenants. So that's what you're seeing on the first couple of lines. You're seeing that adjustment and the revenue and the expenses. There was also a slight reduction in tourism revenue of $3,000 that has been removed. So that's proposed here as well tonight. We figured we'd bring as many adjustments back at the same time. And we did just recently discover that there will be a slight increase in the janitorial services for the library in Uniac, as well as the RCMP building in Rawdon. So we've included that slight increase in this adjustment that we're bringing forward. And we just found out this week that there is an increase in the NSFM fees, annual fees, and I believe the CAO is going to speak about that, so we've included that in here as well. We didn't have that last week when we were presenting the budget. So having said all of that, if we were to move forward with all of these recommended changes, then there would be the potential to use the savings towards a 3 cent commercial reduction if council chose to go that route. Or for council's benefit, this change, which is roughly $50,000, is about 0.22 of a cent on the general tax rate. The general tax rate, 1 cent raises 223,000 and change. So it's less than a quarter of a cent if we left it on the GTR and didn't amend the commercial tax rate. So I'm happy to answer any questions or.
It's starting to light up, Sue. Just
Okay.
hold on 1 second.
Thank
First
you.
up, Warden Rolson.
Thank you. I have several questions around
Sure.
this. First, can you tell me, we all know that our residential taxpayers have by and large seen large increases in their assessment, which even those who are capped are seeing over 7%.
Correct.
Did we see the same types of increase in commercial assessments, or were they more flat?
I can't specifically say to each commercial account. I don't have that right here in front of me. We certainly saw growth in the commercial area, but primarily that was new development, not necessarily commercial business that was already established.
So we haven't seen huge increases in the assessments of our existing commercial businesses?
Correct, unless something's changed, right?
Yeah.
Unless they've
Unless they,
continued to
improved or added or whatever.
correct.
Okay, because given the fact that our residents are facing such steep increases in assessments and the commercial increases are not nearly as dramatic as the residential increases, I'm not really inclined to have the residents fund a commercial decrease this particular year. That's just my opinion on that. Regarding the NSFM fee increase, I'm okay to leave that in the budget. But I want to be very clear that leaving that in the budget for me does not make a decision to pay the NSFM dues. I think that should be, I think it warrants a completely separate discussion. That's a just over 6%, I think 6.1% increase this year. Last year, I believe, was somewhere around 14%. And in the 3 or 4 years prior to that, I think it was something like 40% overall that we've paid. And even if we just go back the past 2 years and say approximately 20%, I personally have not seen an increase of 20% of deliverables from the NSFM in the last 2 years. That's my opinion. So I really think, especially following the meeting that is scheduled to take place on Thursday, that the NSFM dues and, I think that requires further discussion. I'm not objecting to leaving the dollars in the budget now. We may well decide that we're going to pay it and that the NSFM will be, going forward, meeting our needs and justifying the cost. But I think we need to have the discussion to determine that. So that's my comment there, and I just, I don't know, can we leave it in the budget with that understanding, I guess is the question.
Yes.
Through
Sierra's
you-
going to speak.
Through you, Mr. Warden, absolutely. The NSFM fee increase, it's actually, the fee increase itself isn't as much as $5,300. We had budgeted based on last year's budget, not their actual. So because they had such a large increase last year as well, that's why that number is a little higher. So this invoice is actually going to council tomorrow night for decision of council to be paid or not paid. And we can have a more fulsome discussion at that time. You could put off paying that invoice for a month or two until we see how Thursday night or Thursday's meeting shakes out.
Yeah, I won't be prepared to make a decision to pay that invoice until after Thursday.
Yeah.
Next up, Councillor Rondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to staff. In the last number of years, how many times have we decreased in the amount of decrease for the commercial rate? Seems to me I remember for the last number of years, we have decreased that commercial rate. Could you refresh me on that? That would have been my first question.
Thank you, through the chair. It has remained at $2.60, the base commercial rate, for at least 3 years, I think. But you are correct, there was, not that long ago, it was $2.71, and then we reduced it through council to $2.66, and then it went down 5 more cents. So it went down 10 cents over 2-3 years, for sure, and then 1 cent. So, but it's remained at $2.60 for at least, I think, 3 years.
For how much?
2-3 years. $2.60.
No, for how many years? I just didn't.
I think 2-3 years, it's been at $2.60. Yeah.
So over the last number of years, we have shown that we have worked with that commercial rate by dropping it. I'm not in favor of reducing this commercial rate this year by 3 cents, not whatsoever. When I see and I hear stories that I'm hearing now, people having to choose between, food, pills, heat, and so on, with the diesel prices and the furnace oil prices rising, just today and through interrupter clause. When I hear stories about going to the grocery store and they're picking the cheapest thing on the thing, not the healthy thing, but the cheapest, that's who I'm looking to help. And I'll be quite honest, everybody was kind of up and very happy that we can reduce the tax rate. Well, I'm sorry. That's just a good song to sing, as far as I'm concerned, because I figured this out the other day while I was watching the executive. On $150,000 on assessment last year, based in 85 cents. And at this year's, at 7.7%, on that same 150, it had 7.7%. Reduce that rate, we are still gonna pay another $50, almost another $50 extra out of your pocket. So this may be all sound good and peachy and roses. Yes, East Hants is gonna drop the tax rate, but that's not helping the people out there. They're still gonna be paying more money. And I, in this budget, would like to see us reduce that even further. And I know it's not gonna be popular, but I know there's, we're saying by growth, we need this, we need this many more extra employees, we need this. I think we should be looking at bare bones, and maybe some of the things should have to be put off maybe for a year or two, and maybe we'll just have to get done what we can get done, because I think we can do better than the 3 cents on that end of it, because there's a lot of people out there who are in dire consequences right now, and that $50, and if that $50 they're gonna have to pay, they're not paying it at businesses. That's $50 they don't pay on businesses in East Hants. So that's my feeling on the commercial tax rate. I think it should remain the same, and we should be looking at even further cuts to try to help the working people out there who don't fall under the exemption and are out there and are struggling to work every day. That's what I'll be looking for in this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I brought this, I didn't mean to take it away from the residential. I just want the impact on the tax, like how much it's gonna cost. And I'm pretty sure we could find that in the deed transfer tax, we could get 50,000 from there. Just to show people that we care for everybody the same, commercial or residential. I didn't mean to cut the 22.22 from the residential to cover commercial. And yes, the commercial rate went up, and more than 8% too. I could tell you that on my assessment too. So I don't know about everybody else, but to say it stayed the same, I don't think so. Everybody across the board went up, so. And yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I look at it a little differently. $50,000 being put on the general tax rate. I believe you said it'd just be, would be pennies, I guess, on each assessment, would it not? Roughly?
So what we're proposing here, the general tax rate would stay at the reduction of 3 cents, and we're pulling in money from reserves, and there's adjustments there. So there would be, this is what we're proposing if you wanted to reduce the commercial rate. Otherwise, if we left the commercial rate the same, you could slightly reduce the general tax rate with this model. Certainly, council can do,
Right.
whatever you
I understand
want to.
that.
Sure, yeah.
Businesses out there just come through a pandemic and they're hurting. And their prices are also going up. They're having a hard time to scrape too. And I understand where Councillor Rhino is coming from, and I don't disagree with him. But the fact is, they've got things coming up. One thing that's coming up is the minimum wage. And that's going to be detrimental to these businesses that employ people. And I think for the amount of money it is there, I think we can find that $50,000 somewhere. I don't think I'm in full support of lowering it 3 cents, and I think we have to look after our commercial businesses as well as our residents too. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hebben. What is proposed here by staff is that there will be a 3 cent in their numbers here, no effect to the general tax rate, a 3 cent reduction in both the residential and the commercial rate, and it has no impact. That's what they're proposing here right now. Just because people are talking about taking from one rate to the other, they're not taking anything from one rate to the other. Next up, Warden.
But with all the adjustments there, if we did not reduce the commercial rate by 3 cents, we could reduce the residential rate to 0.8178 instead of 0.82, which is a slight reduction. It's just where that money goes. I guess my question is, where are we at 260? Are we middle of the pack? Are we high? Are we low when we compare to?
I would look to the Director of Corporate Services in comparing the tax rate I wouldn't know right off like how we compare to Halifax or Truro as far as our yeah, we can pull it together for sure.
I would like to see that before making any final decision, because, you know, if we're the same or lower as everyone around us, I'm, you know, more apt to say, well, okay. Because I don't think on a commercial assessment that 3 cents is going to make a business change their mind on where they're going to locate particularly. I'd like to have that information. I know we used to look at, you know, compared to small towns and, you know, different places, but I'd be interested in having that information. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Councilor Ryan.
Well, I guess I respect Councillor Hibbs' thoughts. What I'm looking at is if we can find $50,000 to replace it, and that rate of decrease of 3% on the commercial rate, that's a quarter of a cent, roughly, on the residential rate. And, you know, 5 pennies make a nickel, and if we keep going after this a penny at a time, we'll get, you know, lower that rate even more. So I guess that's where I'm coming from. If we can find it to lower that, I'd rather lower that on the residential rate.
Pass the chair to the warden, and I'm going to speak on this as well. The businesses here in East Hants are just as vital to East Hants as the residents who live here. The businesses in East Hants employ a lot of residents in East Hants. We have, for the last 3 years, done small decreases to the residential rate, and we are proposing another quite substantial decrease to the residential rate. I personally don't see any issue where it is such a small difference. This difference, you know, April 1st, there's a carbon tax coming, which all businesses are going to be levied against, which is increasing their cost. And they're not going to be eligible for a rebate on any of those things, unlike residents. According to the plan by the federal government, residents will be able to receive certain rebates at a certain percentage. So the businesses in East Hants are in for a rough time, and they're still, as was pointed out by Councillor Head, recovering from COVID. I believe that this is not a huge impact. It's actually next to no impact for the residents, and it's at least a show of faith that we value the businesses here as much as the residents, because they both provide what we have in our communities. If we had no businesses, we'd have very few residents because they would have nowhere to work. So I believe the two go hand in hand, and we can't consistently say we're going to continually hammer the business sector in East Hants, which is the smallest sector we have, right? Our best bet for long-term reduction in the general tax rate for residents is to build the business section in East Hants. And any way we can do it to attract businesses and make them go move here to both whatever area you want, the rural, the suburban, the urban, it doesn't matter. Any attraction we can have for commercial entities to come here beyond our business parks that employ people, I think is valuable. So I agree, we should see what the comparable areas are. I mean, comparing us to HRM makes absolutely no sense when HRM's tax rate is going up every year by 2.9% just for their green fund alone on their general rate, not to mention whatever increases they have for all their services. So I think we need to look at comparable size business areas and have that come back. And then that will give us a better picture to understand the impact and maybe even, you know, talk to some of the businesses. We all talk to the residents. Talk to the businesses in your area and find out, you know, just how close some of them are. Because I know I talked to a few in my area, and some of them they're week to week whether they're going to stay in business, and that's 5 to 7 families are going to be without a job if they go under. And so it's dire for everybody right now with inflation and increased cost and supply chain issues. So we have to look at all of the residents, and the commercial businesses are residents within East Hants. Thank you. Okay. Councillor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To add up to Deputy Warden, I have a restaurant in a business park, and I hear from businesses why they come to East Hants. It's because our rate is better than Halifax. Our location is greater, and that's why they're here. So if you look at what we had 5 years ago before we start reducing the rate, we couldn't sell any lot in the business park. Look at our business park now. We are looking for lots to be able to locate people there. So if you tell me 3 cents or 5 cents or 2 cents is not gonna affect customer to come to East Hants, yes, it does. And the Uniac Business Park have proved it. I moved there 20 years ago, and 15 years after I moved, I was praying for God to bring businesses there. And now I see them, and they want to come here, and they want more land to come here. So that's all I could say about the situation. Thank you.
Well, no, I am not hammering on business. I think we have demonstrated over the last number of years by cutting that rate substantially that we are serious about business. I'm saying this year, let's keep it the same and see what we can help out the people. That's my point. And then, like, I'm not anti-business, but we've shown how much over the last number of years. So this year, I want, with the people that are having the dire straits are in, you know, that's what I want to concentrate on. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rano. Seeing nobody left to speak, I guess you can continue on, Sue. I don't see a motion, I just see. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so we can continue on and move forward. Yeah.
Through the chair, I will add, the last time that the commercial rate decreased was in the budget for 2019, and it went to 260 at that time. So it hasn't changed since then. So it went 270, it went up to 271, then down to 266, 261, and then 260, and it's held the last 3 years, and we've left it in the proposed budget that was presented last week. It was 260. Okay. So no other questions?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we will take it back with some of those commercial questions and report back at the next budget meeting with some more information on that commercial information. So the next item, are there any other questions about what's on this list? I may touch on some of them as we go. So getting back into, there's no questions. Oh, Norval Mitchell has a question.
Councillor Mitchell.
Yeah, just a quick question on the proposed 3-cent commercial rate decrease. Was that set in stone, or could you decrease it 1 cent or 2 cents instead of the 3, or?
Whatever you want.
I believe they can do whatever we want as the will of council, Councillor Mitchell.
Okay.
We can set whatever rates we would like.
Okay. Did you look at one or two? Okay. Right. Okay.
To move it over to the general tax rate, the general tax rate would go up slightly.
So councillors, next we'll get back into our business plans, maybe for the next half an hour or so. So the first, going back to your budget document that you have, the binder, that's what these business plan pages reflect in here. Infrastructure and operations is split between two different groups. You've got your water utility and wastewater management section, which is our services section, and then you have the general tax rate services that they provide. So you've got about 25 staff in total. 10 of them are primarily general tax rate driven staff for those services. 6 are allocated out between general tax rate and water utility. And then we have 9 urban service rate water utility staff in this department. The net impact on the general tax rate this year for this department is $806,000, and that would be after all of your ins and outs from reserves have happened. Significant portion of that, of course, is the new solid waste management contracts that we have awarded or are going to award. The net increase for contracts, which we have a detailed slide in the next section, is about $453,000. So that is significant given the contract amounts. We do have those contracts issued for the next number of years. We also, in this budget, have a new position proposed at the Waste Management Center. We have the some succession planning to do at the Waste Management Center, as well as the demand for services out there are increasing, and the volume of material that we're receiving is increasing as well. So there is a new full-time position in the budget for that. And then some miscellaneous projects out of the Waste Management Center for that are being funded from the reserves. In your operations section, there is an increase of about $103,000 on your contracts, primarily related to transportation infrastructure, chloride, reconditioning gravel roads, ditching of municipal ditches on municipal roads, and then asphalt patching as well. So the actual increase in costs are not $103,000, but that's the impact on your general tax rate. So it's about $80,000 of increase in costs, and then you have about $28,500 in decreases in amounts that we're recommending come from reserves to cover your costs. The reason being is quite often we will put, if a new service is going in place or if council asks for something new to be done and we're not sure exactly how much that's going to cost, we'll fund it from reserves. The next year you'll see that reserves being lessened because it's now part of your annual maintenance planning for whatever infrastructure it is that you're looking at. Your snow removal budgets are going from $390 to $425. So that would be the addition of new roads, and funding of $60,000 is proposed to come from the snow removal reserve budget for that.
Well, we have a question there, CAO. Councillor Rhino.
Where would I find the position for that waste management center costing on that, or can you tell me right off without looking?
Through you, that would be, I can't tell you right off without going through my computer, which is on the screen right now, which I can't do. Janice, do you have any, or Jordan? So while Jordan looks that up, I'll just put this up on the screen. This is the waste management expenses that are related to your collection contracts, your transportation contracts, and your processing costs. So as you can see, we've got some significant increases. These aren't all price increases. Some of them are related to the tonnage of materials that we're processing, transporting, and collecting. So part of it is new curbside collection contracts, plus the amount of volume that we're moving from our waste management center to the first generation landfills or second generation landfills around the province. So I think Sue has the amount for you, Councillor Rhino.
84,100 all in, including benefits.
I didn't hear that.
$84,100 all in, including the benefits for that position.
All right, that's very close to a half cent on the tax rate we could save right there. Thank you.
So there's no questions on this slide. So on your infrastructure and operations, your capital work that's being done by this department, I've been through, I think, all of these projects when I introduced the business plans. There is a lot of work being done here, plus the two engineers that we have on staff for engineering now. Council did approve another development project engineer last year to be included in this budget. Those two engineers will be working on these projects as well as all of the development control work for new subdivisions, roads and whatnot. In the wastewater side, we look into the urban service budgets. The first two items there, the aerator rental and the wastewater blower repairs, those two projects are proposed to come in from reserve, so they're not affecting the urban service rate tax rate per se, although they are using the reserves. Both of those projects are really in anticipation of the Lance optimization study for the Lance Lagoon. So we are doing that study right now. Staff are sort of finalizing that work. And these two items will sort of buy us time until we know what needs to be done at that Lance Lagoon to make it optimized and running as efficiently as possible. We do have significant power increases in our wastewater this year. That's a combination of the power rate increases, as well as we're anticipating that we'll be running the additional blower at the lagoon. So that, I mean, these are massive pieces of equipment, and the power required for those would make a significant difference in your budget. So we've budgeted for that accordingly. There's several capital projects on the go in wastewater, and we also have in this budget under the urban service rate a wastewater operator position. Again, we have some succession that we're looking at for the wastewater team in the near future, as well as the growth and the demand on the system as we move more into our the wastewater treatment plant in Shubenacadie, making sure we have someone on staff who learns that as we're building that is critical at this point in our growth, and making sure that plant has operators that can run it. Also on the urban service rate, the wastewater management fee. So that is the charge that is on the water bills that's billed for the urban service rate. Right now it's at $10 per 1,000 gallons. There's a proposed no change in that rate this year. And the increase in the wastewater management fee revenue is proposed to be about $12,000. So that would be based on higher usage of 1.4 million gallons based on the water utility numbers. This budget is also where you have your sidewalks. So we do have an increase of $30,000 for sidewalk budgets, and we funded that from reserves. Again, as we grow our communities, we're taking over more sidewalks in subdivisions and on main roads. And unsure exactly of, so if you look at this winter, I think we dropped the plow for the first time on January 22nd. So these budgets are really hard to predict. So again, the increase, until we see it actually happen, we would recommend you fund that increase from reserves. If it doesn't happen, you haven't raised your tax rates to accommodate it. If it does happen, then you raise your tax rates the next year to accommodate it. There's nothing worse than collecting taxes that you don't have to collect because the expenses didn't materialize. So you are able to, with your reserves, use that theory through a lot of this budget to help keep those rates in check. And again, on the reserve side, you've got the blower maintenance and the aerator rental coming from reserves. The one big difference you don't have coming from reserves this year for in the urban service rate is the service study for the corridor was in the 2022-2023 budget, and $100,000 of that was being funded from reserves. So you'll see that big variance, but that's because you don't have that project this year, so you're going to see the difference in the reserves for that $100,000, which is significant. And lastly, there's the Milford urban service rate. So if you'll think about your system in the corridor, you don't have water utility in Milford. So they are unable to pay that wastewater management fee of $10 per 1,000 gallons on their water bill and have it transferred back over to the municipality for the wastewater. So the urban service rate in Milford is always higher than the urban service rate everywhere else because they do have to contribute their fair share to the wastewater system. It is a tough calculation to do, to say, are they paying enough, are they not paying enough? And of course, when you do things based on assessment, that's always difficult to do because you have such swings in assessment across the board and people use different amounts of wastewater in their homes. So we would predict that the Milford folks aren't quite paying their fair share, and I'll use quotes because that's sort of an estimate. So we would recommend that we slightly increase that rate by 0.5 cent to hold it at 34.5 cents, where you're seeing the decrease on the overall urban service rate of 0.5 cent. We would recommend that you increase the Milford urban service rate to hold it. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah.
But
We're scrambling here trying to find the payroll, and then because there's overlap in positions, that's why we did that. So there's one position going and one position coming.
But still, if I may, you're bringing it in from the reserve. That's bringing it in, we could bring that money in and lower the, bringing that money in to that, right? So that's my point.
We just wanted to clarify about that payment amount wasn't as high as what we first said.
Thank you, Janice.
So, Mr. Chairman, you would typically bring the money in from reserves for one-time costs. So that difference that's being brought in is for the overlap. We have one retiring staff person that will need an overlap with a new person to do the training in succession. So that's what that $15,000 is for, to bring it in to cover. You could bring in $1 million from reserves if you wanted to offset and drop your tax rate, but you're then going to be playing catch up. And we've had this conversation around the table year after year. And we have, over the years, decided at the last minute, okay, well, let's bring in $200,000 from reserves to offset the tax rate. We've done that over the years. But at some point, you always have to play that catch up. So, that's certainly a conversation that we can have when we're talking about the adjustment tables and what we can adjust in the budget. But that particular position, that is why some of it's being brought in from reserve.
Okay, Councillor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm gonna make Councillor Rhino happy for once. So we're just counting for 1,650,000. Are we gonna talk about the deed transfer tax? Or no? We're done with it? Through the budget, are we gonna talk about it? Yeah, so we're bringing we're always underestimating. We're a growing municipality. We have so many things on the move. That money should go in a general tax rate. We're leaving it as a surplus, and we having one group after the other. We're making 850,000 this year, 900. They're counting how many dollars we're making every year, and they're coming on us like we don't want to support them. So I think the amount coming from the deed transfer tax should be, at least we should know what we have until this month, how much we raised, and we can use that to reduce tax, because that's supposed to be added to the general tax rate, right?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, if you wanted to use your deed transfer tax to reduce this tax rate, you would either have to commit to putting it into reserve this year and bringing it out next year, which then you're still a year behind, so eventually you have to find it, or you commit to putting your deed transfer tax budget up and hope you meet the
Exactly.
budget.
That's what I'm asking for. We should know how much we have until, like, I know it's not up till March, till we know the full amount. But we should know the amount till today. And if it's $2 million, we could bring $2 million. Why we always have surplus like every year from the deed transfer tax and not using it the same year? Like the deed transfer tax it's not gonna drop. Everybody knows that's gonna go. We have like 5,000-6,000 units coming here in the corridor. We have like almost 1,000 coming in Mount Uniac, and all those property gonna be sold. They're not gonna, like the builder's not gonna sit on them, just build them. They're gonna be sold. So we should count more on a deed transfer tax, and if we can reduce the general tax rate on residents, why not?
So, Mr. Chairman, I think what we need to do, if council wishes, which I think you should, we can prepare bring you the analysis we've done on the deed transfer tax, so you can make that decision whether you want to increase your budget or not for deed transfer tax and reduce your general rate for that. That's really, so when staff look at those numbers, it's difficult. It's another difficult number to pin down. But if you want to take that risk and increase your budget, you can absolutely do that. But you need to see the numbers and go through that analysis yourselves. So we can bring that to you as a separate line item on an agenda to do an overview of the deed transfer tax, and then you can collectively decide if you want to increase your budget for deed transfer tax or not. I know in years gone by you've done that, and it's been great. We hit the number and we moved on. I think at that time, you committed to putting some of your current year surplus into reserve in case you didn't meet the number, and then you could bring it in, so you could do that again if you wanted. That's sort of that safe way to go, but we can certainly have that on a future budget meeting, a fulsome review of the detransfer tax.
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's, if I see the majority, they want to reduce tax this year, and that's a way to do it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Councilor Rhino.
Okay, this is only my opinion, and, but it seems very convenient and sounds good when we can say, we can put a position in here and, oh, we'll take the money out of the reserves. To me, that's what it sounds like. I would rather take those money from reserve, leave that position out of the budget, and help the tax general rate. That's what I would like to do. It just sounds so good when we're pulling out of reserve. It won't really affect, but yes, it will, because next year, we will be paying for that again, that employee, and for the next year, and then for the next year. This is where I'm coming from. I've seen some hardship. Talking to people working at the food bank the other day, they are seeing an increase. Now, I'd rather take that money and put it into maybe raising the exemption for the tax that they get help back with their taxes, and raising that even further. That's what I'm heading for. So, I'm just not taking this budget and saying it's a great book. No, sir. I'm looking to cut it even further.
Thank you, Councilor Rhino. And just to clarify, this position is going to be replacing somebody who's retiring. The budget is to cover the overlap. So.
No.
No, it isn't?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I'm mistaken. Warden Rolls.
Thank you. Well, I guess I hear what Councillor Rhino is saying. I agree with Councillor Musa, and I do agree that we should have a look at the deed transfer tax, and we may well be able to do something more. My concern with eliminating this recommended position or any of these recommended positions is that I know from sitting here many years that before we ever get to look at this budget, there's been more cut out of this than we can even imagine. And my concern is with the growth that we're experiencing in the municipality and the increase in the demand for services, including those at the Waste Management Center, that I don't want to put our service delivery standard at risk. And if we have grown to the point that we need another position there, I don't want lineups at the Waste Management Center because, you know, the public can't be served. I don't want if an employee, or what happens if 2 employees are off sick. We're approaching critical things, I think, there. So I don't consider, it's not like we're adding a position there every year. It's been quite some time. So I'm prepared to listen to justification for that position and to believe that staff truly felt it was justified, or we wouldn't be seeing it. I do hear, I do hear the comments around reducing the tax further, and if we can do that without reducing our service delivery standards, I'm all for that. But we passed, a year ago now, we passed a motion increasing positions in this municipality relating to RCMP to carry on over a number of years. And had we not seen the unprecedented growth in assessment that we've seen, we wouldn't be looking at reducing the tax rate by even 3 cents. We would be looking at an increase to cover what we had already agreed to do. So I'm just, I'm going to listen to everything, but I'm not prepared to support cutting for the sake of cutting. I will need to see a reason why it can be cut or put off a year or whatever. It's not going to be. And I think when you have a retirement of someone who's been in a position for many years and you fill that position, it's going to take some time to get up to speed and to learn the job. And if there's a new position needed, that's probably when it's needed most, is when you're getting back up to speed and capacity there. So I guess those are just my comments. The tax rate is definitely important, and we definitely want to make it as affordable as we can for folks to live in East Hants. I'm very pleased that we're starting out with a 3 cent decrease. Can we get it lower? Perhaps we can. We'll look at that deed transfer picture and see if there's something we can do there. I would rather look at that than just saying positions aren't needed, because I haven't done the review to tell me whether that the position isn't needed. And historically, I see the growth and I see the increase in the demand for services. And historically, I don't believe that staff have brought forward, we don't always receive them well, and they don't bring forward requests for positions lightly. So those are my comments. I'm still listening, but not convinced that that position should be cut at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Next up, Councillor Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I 100% agree with the warden. That's why we have CAO, we have director. They know they need the position, and we should support them with that. We shouldn't be looking at the reduction to not give them the right to hire people, especially now. We have the burnout, like nobody, if somebody gets sick, nobody there. So, and I want to ask everybody, if you ever look at Viewpoint, have you ever, I've lived in Mount Uniac for 30 years. I've never seen 120 building lot in Mount Uniac up for sale at once. So we gotta expect that growth is coming and we gotta be ready for it. That's all I could say. The transfer tax gonna be up to the sky. Anybody says that, I can argue with them all day long. So we can count on it. We can reduce tax without jeopardizing our staff or eliminating any position. All I can say for now. Thank you.
Councillor Tingley.
Through the chair, I also want to say I agree 100% with the warden's comments around staffing and the tax rate. I agree with Councillor Rhino as well. You know, if we can find a way to lower the tax further, that's great. But I don't think we should just be focusing on lowering the tax rate every 10 minutes during this discussion. I think we should just go through the numbers, determine where everything sets, and learn more about the reserves, why we have these reserves. I assume we have these reserves because we know we're going to have future expenses, and you know, if you take it out, there are for other things. There's risk associated with that. We are a growing municipality. I've only been on council for a little over a year, and the growth we've had, I think staff are working with less over the last year, and working their tails off. I certainly don't want to sit here and say we're not going to add another staff member that's being recommended by the CAO or the directors until we hear the full story here. But I think we should let the tax rate. We'll determine what the tax rate is. We just need to go through the numbers and find out where it sets. But just listening to the discussion, I agree with Councillor Rhino. If we can find a way to cut the tax rate further, let's cut it. But let's. I do not like the idea of talking about cutting staff.
Thank you, Councillor. CAO, back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to address the position at the Waste Management Center. I've had several meetings around staffing over the last 4 or 5 months, over the last 2 years really, but getting prepared for this budget, looking at the needs of the organization over the last 4 to 5 months. And I've had conversations with council as well on those. So this particular position, the Waste Management Center, and Jesse, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I remember is that we haven't had a new full-time position in the Waste Management Center. I think it's 20 years. I think that's an accurate statistic. What we've been operating with over that's 20 years of growth in East Hants that you've seen, that the same 3 folks have been operating equipment and running the site with a scale house operator. And we run a phenomenal site compared to what it could be. So your level of service is excellent for the small amount of people we have working out there. So 20 years it's been since we've added a position out there. We have one of our senior folks who is retiring in the middle of this fiscal year. So even if he was not retiring, I would be looking for an equipment operator at the site going forward, an additional one. As you've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, if one person is not available at that site, it has ripple effects through all of the services that are provided. So what we have been doing up to this point in the last 3 budgets, I think, maybe 2, we've had a fairly significant seasonal position at the site for the whole summer. So it's been sort of early May to end of October, we've had a seasonal person there to pick up that slack. That money is gone out of the budget. So that kind of, it's moved from part-time dollars into full-time dollars. So that would be part of the extra $65,000 that we were talking about. As well, in order to get this person trained while the other person is retiring, we do need some overlap. So that's that extra $15,000. That's the only part of that is a one-time cost. So that's why we brought it in from reserves. So it's not that we flippantly bring money in and out from reserves. We think about what we're doing and why we would do it and how you could justify it and make sure that it's not going to impact your budgets the year after and the year after. So I can't remember what the exact amount of part-time dollars that was in that budget last year. I'm gonna say it was 25,000-ish. So that money is no longer in the budget. The full-time money is in the budget, so those are offset. And if you were to remove that position, then the part-time money would have to go back in because we still need someone to do the work. So that's sort of some of the elements as we talked through that discussion. You know, and having an extra person at that waste management center doesn't just impact the waste management center. It impacts all of the folks that are sort of upriver from them. So you look at our manager of solid waste who has a portfolio much larger than she should have. She should be able to be giving some of her work plan to the manager of the waste management center, but they're too busy operating equipment to take on that extra workload, to alleviate her workload, and then it goes to Jesse and then it comes to me. So that's the impact of adding an operator, is to also provide some room sort of downriver from them. So that's the rationale as to why that amount is in the budget, why you have a position being proposed in the budget. You have every right to take that money out, but I do need to still operate a waste management center and retain the staff that I have in my solid waste division. So once you make your decisions, then I'll have to make mine. And you will have a human resource report. It's just, I've got the first draft yesterday morning. So you will have a human resource report that outlines all of these changes that are being proposed in the budget, and the impact on your HR budgets and whatnot. That should be with you by your next budget meeting, next Tuesday night.
Thank you, CAO. Councillor Rhino.
Well, I just want to clarify. We do have a bang-up waste management center or dump or whatever you want to call it. And, you know, we're proud of it. I am looking for ways that we can cut this tax rate. And this is an example that we can hold this in our back of our mind, and as we work our way through the budget. Maybe we can find somewhere else. I don't know. But an FYI, you're saying 20 years you haven't had a staff increase? Go back 5 more years, just for an FYI, one man run that place. I know there's been significant changes, but when I started here, one man. So just for an FYI, thank you.
Warden Rolls.
I can remember through you, Mr. Chair, when one person ran the landfill as it was at that time as well, but the regulation was significantly different than it is now, and what that person was responsible for and responsible to do bears very little resemblance to what's done there now. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, council. We are coming up to the point of adjournment. So we'll take it up from here because that's a good spot to end the waste management. We haven't moved into any of the other items there, and we'll kick off with the recreation, Parks, Recreation, Culture at our next budget meeting. Warden Ralston, go ahead.
Just before we adjourn, I just wonder if I could get an idea of how many folks are thinking they can get to the NSFM meeting on Thursday?
I will be there.
So Councillor Tingley, myself, Deputy Warden, Councillor Mitchell. So, and if anyone else gets freed up before then, I encourage you. I've been fielding phone calls from other municipal units. There's a lot of concern out there. And I'm just afraid that a day meeting in January in Nova Scotia is not scheduled for optimum attendance by members, particularly when many members have day jobs and are not able to attend through the day. So I thank you for that, and maybe we could have a chat and see about carpooling or something along that line. Thank you.
Thank you, Warden. Move to adjourn. Looking for motion. Moved and seconded. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sue.
Just a reminder, the next budget meeting is next Tuesday, 6:30 here. Sure. That's up to 7.
Go ahead, Warden.
Well, I know 6:30 meetings are difficult for counselors that work quite often. 2 this evening had, you know, if you want to get home and grab a bite of supper before work, it's impossible. When I worked in Truro, 6:30 meetings were just next to impossible for me. So I just wonder if we could amend the time of start of that meeting to 7 PM, and I would make that motion.
We have a motion to convene the next meeting at 7, vice 6:30. Is there a seconder? Seconded. Any discussion? Question on the motion. Just waiting on one vote. There we go. All the votes are in. The motion's passed unanimously. The time of our next budget meeting will be next Tuesday night, starting at 7 o'clock. No. And we have regular meeting of council